Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to House Taxation Committee. First item of business would be request for bill introductions, and I'd like to welcome Representative Owens to the podium first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to introduce this legislation. This is 23 RS 185. 23 RS 185. Many people don't know that better than 80% of our fire and EMS workers are volunteers. We have a significant shortage of volunteer fire and EMS workers in the state of Kansas. As a result, I would propose legislation that would allow for up to 2 vehicles per year to be property tax free for those members of the fire and EMS department. This is a way where cities, states, and counties can all participate, not only in saying thank you to the members of our fire and EMS department, but also as a recruiting tool as we have a significant lack of volunteers. So with that, I'd request that be introduced.
Committee, are there any questions? Yes, Representative Corbett.
So in your request for this, is there any requirements at all, whether you volunteer 5 hours a month, or is there any statute of how many hours you'd have to be a volunteer to get the deal?
Most volunteer fire departments have certain requirements to even be a member of their department. I served on the Heston Volunteer Fire and EMS Department for 17 years, and we actually had minimum requirements to even be a member of the department. This is also a form very similar to what the fire chief would sign for them to receive their plates, that also the fire chief would have to sign for them to receive this exemption.
So it'd be something similar that we give the military?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it actually will fall under that same statute.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Any objection to the request? Seeing none, the request is approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there other requests for bill introductions? Representative Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got 3 bill requests. If you heard the budget presentation from the governor's office this morning, these are the 3 tax bills that were talked about. The first one is the RS numbers 23 RS 0350. It smooths out the non-taxation of Social Security benefits. You know, right now we have a cliff at 75,000. This smooths it out between 75 and 100,000. Can we do all 3 at once? Yes. Okay.
Well, we'll go ahead and take one at a time.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, committee, are there any questions? Any objection? Seeing none, the request is approved.
Okay. The second one is 23 RS 0363, and that speeds up the elimination of the sales tax on food.
Okay. Committee, any questions? Any objections? Seeing none, the request is approved.
And then the third one is 23 RS 0354, and that is the sales tax holiday on school supplies.
Okay. Any questions? Any objection? With that, the request, the Sawyer trifecta is approved.
Thank you.
Any further introductions? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to introduce 23 RS 0368. This is a bill that I introduced last year. It did pass out of committee, but it never got to the floor for a vote. It concerns creating a tax exemption, a sales tax exemption for building supplies for qualifying community theaters the supplies they use to build their sets.
Yes, those of you who were on the committee last year will remember this one. It's pretty straightforward. Are there any questions? Any objections? Seeing none, the request is approved.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Bergkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce our 23 RS 0187, and this would deal with repealing ad valorem property tax on certain rental vehicles.
Committee, any questions?
Repealing property tax on certain rental vehicles.
Rental vehicles. Yeah. Okay. Any objection? With that, the request is approved. Any further requests for bill introductions? You know, I don't make a habit of meeting on Friday, but with this many bills, we might have to. Oh, I'm kidding. If there are no further bill introduction requests, we will move on. I did want to, I failed to, at our last meeting, visit a little bit about this. Since we are a paperless committee, those of you who are familiar with tax, or if you have another committee that uses the S drive on the legislative network, this is not a public drive. It is where Leah, our committee assistant, puts all of the testimony, all the documentation for the tax committee is on. If you open up your file explorer on the network side, I think it's called a 4S. Can't remember what it's the number 4 committees, and then it has an S colon. That's your S drive. If you open that up, you'll have House and Senate folders. You go to the House, it will open up all of the House committees. You'll go to the taxation folder, and then the folders are labeled by day. So the date that we have that meeting, all of the information will be in there. It is searchable. So when we start working bills, if you need to search for House Bill 1234, you can search for that and bring up the testimony, proponents, opponents, all the information there. But if you have any questions about that, if that's new to you, I'm happy to help you out. I'm dangerous. I know enough to be dangerous with a computer, so hopefully I can get that resolved. But if anybody has questions, that's how we will access the committee documents. With that, I would like to turn to our item of business for today and welcome to Tax Committee Mark Burkhart. He is the Secretary of the Kansas Department of Revenue, and he will be going over the annual report for the department. Welcome to committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, for those of you I have not met and are new to the committee, my name is Mark Burkhart, and have been Secretary of Revenue now, going into, I guess, my 5th year. So my goal today was to, again, for the new committee members, give them a little idea how the department operates, and then for everyone on the committee, kind of bring you up to date where we stand with tax operations in the Department of Revenue, and also information regarding some specific tax types that are the principal funding mechanisms for state government. So with that having been said, again, I think you have on the material that we had prepared, and right at the very front is an organization chart of the department. And if you go through that, you'll see that there are a lot of support services that report to the secretary. And there are just a couple of those that I would like to emphasize as being very important to the department. Our Office of Financial Management, not only does it handle the financial affairs for the Department of Revenue, it also is involved very heavily with distributions going back to local units of government and how those distributions are accounted for. A very important part of the department. And just in the big scheme of things, the department itself is roughly 1,060 employees. I think that was in our budget for the current year. Our budget's about $113 million for the current year. Our legal services division has roughly 25 attorneys, and these attorneys are involved in a variety of matters, not only taxation appeals, but also driver's license hearings and appeals within the department. We have literally thousands of appeals that get filed that have to go to hearing, and that's what these attorneys, their roles are, in addition to just handling routine operations within the department in terms of personnel matters and things of that nature. Research or policy and research. If you don't know, you will know very shortly. Kathleen Smith is our Director of Policy and Research, and you will see her a lot this session. Her office prepares the fiscal notes for the tax bills that come before this committee, and that office also is involved heavily with the development of tax policy, all of our instructional material for taxpayers, education materials, tax forms, everything tax related really kind of funnels through that office. Another extremely important part of the department is our information services. Obviously, as you know, so much of what we do now is electronic, and we are promoting that very heavily, not only in the tax area, but in the driver's license area, trying to get drivers to renew their driver's licenses online and not having to go into a station and do it there. But IS is very important, and we have roughly 80 to 85 employees at any given time in that area. And because we have so many operating systems within the department, those professionals become extremely important. And one of the highest priorities that we have is the security of our systems, because all of your personal information is in these databases maintained by the Department of Revenue. We undergo audits with the IRS in terms of our security, Social Security Administration, legislative post-audit. So we are undergoing constant audits and reviews of our systems. And I can't get into the specifics of what we do, but I assure you that the systems that are in place within the Department of Revenue go well beyond the systems that are put in place just through our Office of Information Services, OITS, with the state of Kansas. And that is due in large part to the fact that we are dealing with such sensitive tax information and personal information about taxpayers. And just to give you an idea how important this is to us, on any given day, our systems block roughly 500,000 attempts to get into our operating systems that are unauthorized. So you can see why security is so very, very important to us. So moving on then to the next unit is audit services. We have roughly 66 staff in that area. Audit services is basically involved in the process of ensuring compliance with our tax code. And I'll talk about it a little later in this session, but we have put in place some things at the department, again, using the technology that's available to make audits easier for taxpayers. Instead of having an auditor from the department show up at your premises for 2 weeks, so much of this information that we need to see is electronic. In electronic form, we can exchange that information so that we don't have to impose on the taxpayer. But I'll talk about that in a little while in more detail. But again, audit services is very important. And then some of the other divisions, and today my focus is going to be on the Division of Taxation, but we have our ABC division, which obviously licenses all of our alcoholic beverage control registered facilities. And we also have the property valuation division in that area. If the committee is so inclined, if you want to get into that in detail, that's a day by itself. And David Harper is our director of the Division of Property Valuation. Then we also have our Division of Vehicles. Most of you would come in contact with that division when you're renewing your driver's license. You would also come in contact if you're getting your car titled. So we have roughly, 350 or more employees in that division. And once again, we are trying to utilize technology as much as possible to make it less burdensome on folks who have to renew their driver's license or pay your property tax on your vehicle registration You can do all of that online now and not have to go into a treasurer's office or have to go into a Department of Revenue driver's license station. So then the focus again today will be on the Division of Taxation, and you can see the units within the division. And I'll talk about each of those as we go along this, this next hour or so. So, Department of Revenue, what do? We collect receipts. And if you look on page 1, you'll see that in fiscal year 2022, we collected $13,479 million in various taxes and fees, and accounted for those and made sure those who paid those amounts were properly credited with those payments. And as you can see, what are the largest sources of receipts for the state of Kansas in terms of funding state government? From a tax perspective, you're looking at individual income tax, followed by sales tax, and then corporate income tax and compensating use tax are two that kind of flip from year to year in terms of their priority. But those are the 4 major tax types that account for most of the funding of state government. If you look through that list on page 1, you'll see the receipts, and you'll see how individual income tax, for example, in 2022, was up 6.2% over the prior year. It's been a very interesting process analyzing tax receipts when they come in. During the pandemic, we were of the mind that income tax receipts would probably drop off. There might be some issue with withholding tax coming in. Withholding tax is what's withheld from your wages. But surprisingly, they never did drop off. In fact, they kept growing and still continue to do so. And withholding tax is the principal component of these income tax receipts that are showing here, the individual income tax receipts. The corporate income tax, you'll see an 18% increase from fiscal year 2021 up to $844 million, which is attributable in large part to the fact that last year was one of the most profitable years, maybe the most profitable years for corporations. So it is reflected in the receipts that have come in. And then sales and use tax also continue to show growth. And when we get back to the compensating use tax section, we're going to talk about some of the legislation that was passed in 2021 that has dramatically impacted those receipts in terms of the marketplace facilitator legislation. So,
Mr. Secretary, I did have a quick question. And by the way, committee, I visited with the secretary beforehand. If you have questions during the presentation, we'll go ahead and take those questions at the time rather than waiting until the end. I did have one quick question. The title of that line item is state and local sales tax, sales and use taxes. Is that number, is that also including, that's the entire collection? That's not just the state 6.5 rate, that's all the city and local sales taxes as well?
This particular table and chart is the gross total collections,
okay,
which would include the locals.
Okay.
And we're going to get back to in a couple pages, and we're going to focus solely on state general fund.
Okay, thank you.
So let's turn to page 2, and you'll see how those.
We did have a question from Representative Helgerson.
Well, I have several, and I guess first, Mr. Secretary, you hit on the idea of you're trying to make it simpler for driver's license for people to go in, take care of it, and get it done. But I'd almost argue the other way. You make it simpler so that individuals don't have the training to stay to renew a driver's license. It becomes so easy that we're putting people out there to get their license that shouldn't be driving at all. You ever thought about the other side of the coin?
Yeah, and I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Sometimes in bureaucracy, we decide where you want to make it as easy as possible, and we eliminate some of the thresholds for that are built into the system because we don't want some dummies driving on the road.
Right.
But I am concerned about the simplicity that we are trying to drive toward. Pardon the pun.
The simplicity that I'm talking about is the process of getting that license in terms of whether you have to go into an office to do it or you can do it online. The criteria for qualifying to get that license, I mean, we want safe drivers on the road. We're not suggesting any lessening of standards there for individuals to be licensed in Kansas. Our Division of Vehicles Director is over here as well, David Harper. You have anything to add on that, David? If you do, you'll have to come up here.
That's exactly right. The requirements remain the same. Safe drivers is number one.
I'll hold the rest of the questions.
All of them? If I could just do a little quick follow-up, like let's say, for instance, the vision test. How is the vision test handled on the online renewal process? Is that still part of that system? If you're a certain age, do you no longer qualify to do an online? You have to do that vision test?
At this point in time, I think we're still capped at age 65 to be able to do it online. David, you want to come up and speak? Again, this is David Harper, who has the, I want to say, fortunate opportunity to be the Division of Property Valuation Director and the Division of Vehicles Director.
Good afternoon. For the online renewals, you do have to provide the name of your optometrist, and we check with that to make sure you've had a vision exam within the past 12 months. And you can only renew every other time. So if I renew this term, next time I have to come into the office to renew for an updated picture, those type of things. But we do check the vision, and then people do get turned away because they'll just give us a date and a name, and we verify it. We've set it up a list with the optometrists across the state, and they respond back and say, yes, this person is good to go.
All right. Thanks for that clarification. If there's no further questions, we'll continue, Mr. Secretary.
Moving on to page 2, you'll see how the collections are distributed. And again, most of what comes in goes to the general fund. Between the general fund and the highway fund, that accounts for 80% of the funds that come in. Those are the two destinations for those collections. Moving over then to page 3, and here's where we get into more of the state general fund dollars. And again, you can see the major sources of revenue for the state general fund. Again, individual income tax leading the charge. And again, withholding has been very stable there, and that's what has accounted for that. When you go down a little further, again, corporate income tax, last year, very profitable year. Privilege tax is the tax that's imposed on banks, financial institutions, and you'll see that it dropped from fiscal year 2021, and the reason is fiscal year 2021 was a pretty good year for banks because that was the time period when PPP loans were being processed, and there was a significant amount of fees associated with those that were earned by the banks. So that caused income for fiscal year 2021 to sort of spike because of those fees. But since that program wasn't around in FY22, that's why it dropped down into a more normal pattern. And normally, privilege tax historically has been in maybe the $45 million range. That's a pretty good number from year to year. So it is still up from what an average might be, but down from FY 2021. Sales tax is up. Some of that is attributed to inflation, not all of it. But again, when we look at these numbers for consensus estimating purposes, there is still growth in the sales tax receipts. And then on the use tax, you'll see that it jumped up to $775 million in FY 2022, up from $602 million in 2021. And for those of you who were on the committee will remember that the marketplace facilitator provision was enacted in 2021 session, effective July 1 of that year. And for those of you who weren't around, just very briefly, this provision increased the collections made by out-of-state retailers and marketplace facilitators of tax on products that were delivered into the state of Kansas. Until 2018, those entities were not required to collect any of that tax if they did not have a substantial physical presence in the state of Kansas. That all changed with the Wayfair case. You've probably heard of that, obviously. And the marketplace facilitator provision that was enacted in 2021 kind of sealed all of that. I checked earlier today, and for FY 2022, the just the amount associated with marketplace facilitators was over $100 million. So that increase is largely attributed to the fact that that legislation passed in 2021 and that revenue was collected. So it was always part of our law. The tax was imposed, but it never had to be collected by out-of-state retailers and or marketplace facilitators. So that gives you a sense of, for state general fund purposes, what the funding sources are. And again, for those of you who have been on the committee, most of the bills you're going to see are going to deal with income tax, corporate income tax, sales tax, use tax. Those are the principal taxes and funding sources, and that's what generates most of the bills coming before the committee. Turning over to page 4 and 5, if you're interested in how these taxes impact taxpayers within your own districts, this chart shows on a county by county basis the per capita tax collection for the various taxes: individual income tax, sales tax, property, vehicle property, and real property. So just identify your county and you'll get a sense of the state taxes that are coming from your particular counties. So moving on then to just a little more detail about the division of taxation. On page 6, breaks out the units within the division of taxation, first being tax operations. I would note that Steve Stotts is our director of taxation, has extensive experience. I'm not sure if he's got 40 years or more at this point, but very, very knowledgeable on state taxes. He runs the division of taxation. Within that is customer relations. And John Peterson runs that particular unit. I haven't done this yet, but what I will do is provide the committee members a list of individuals that would be very important to you if you have questions about certain areas who those contact persons might be, and if you have constituent inquiries, where you can direct those inquiries, because we do have specialists in various areas. So moving on down, then we have cigarette and tobacco enforcement, revenue recovery. Revenue recovery is basically our collections unit within the Department of Revenue. Interesting development with the pandemic. A lot of our ways of doing business changed. And this was one of those areas where we could move to a remote work environment, but be very successful doing so. And we still use remote workers a lot in this area. And the benefit of that is that the employees don't have to go to a state office building to work. And it enables us to employ individuals across the state of Kansas, not just in the eastern part of the state where we have our buildings, or down in Wichita. And with the technology that we have, we know exactly the productivity of the employees. And again, it has been very, very successful. Financial and document management. This is where we process paper returns. We have about 92% of taxpayers filing electronically now, which is wonderful. When you have an electronic return, the chances of having an error, it's like 2 or 3%. When you have a paper return, the chances of something going wrong is 10 to 15%. And when you file electronically, well, I'll tell you what the numbers were last year. If you filed your individual income tax return electronically and wanted a direct deposit to your bank account, there were thousands of refunds that occurred within 3 days of the time that you filed your tax return, and you had your refund in your account. And that is after the department does all of its fraud audits of that particular return. And when
Mr.
we get back to
Secretary.
individual income tax, I'll give more specifics on that.
Okay. We did have a question from Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you kind of give me an idea how many remote employees you have across the state doing that function, working from home?
Across the state, I don't think I can give it to you across the state, but that has been a focus of ours. In fact, we worked with the Department of Commerce to reach out to areas of the state where state government has never reached out before. And we have picked up employees, and I will get those stats from our personnel office.
Thank you, sir.
Representative Wassinger, did you have a question?
I probably should use this one. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had the same question about remote workers. I wondered if you'd get back to us about that, because I'd like to see that, as well as my biggest problem is the answering of telephones. And I'm told that things can be directed to the remote workers. How do you monitor that? Because I certainly get a lot of phone calls about not getting return phone calls from revenue as well as labor and other places. So how do you monitor that? And how do you make that better for Kansans, since we all work for Kansans?
Well, and I'll get the information in terms of the remote workers, but we have software in place. We monitor and know exactly when a call comes in, if it's been responded to, the length of time on the phone, down to the second, for all of the individuals who are answering phones. So, but if there is a problem, we need to know about it.
Okay. If I just a quick follow-up. do they have dedicated phone lines from the state?
I'm
Rem-
sorry?
Do they have dedicated phone lines from the state so that you can monitor that? Or are they just using their landline or cell phone?
No, we are using a line that we monitor, that we actually monitor the call. We can listen to the call.
Okay, but did we provide those direct lines to each remote worker, and how much was that of a cost as opposed to them coming into work?
Yeah. Everything that we've done in terms of our enhancements has been done with existing resources with no budget enhancement to do these, additional enhancements to our system. I'm trying to think if there was any funds that would have come in, any federal funds that would have come in to do that, and I'm not recalling that.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Representative Alcala.
Thank you, Adam. I don't want to kick this dead horse around, but so if I would request from you to be able to see the productivity during the highest time of your department when people were working from home, you'd be able to show me that?
Yes.
Okay. And the reason I asked that is because this summer I went to post audit because I was curious because we had so many people working off site, how they tracked the productivity. And I don't want to quote them wrong, but my understanding was that they couldn't put that information together because some departments did, some didn't, and some monitored it but didn't keep records of it. And so that was the only reason I asked you that is because I was curious how your department does that.
If you will go back to page 22 of the material that's been provided to you,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
it will have a matrix that shows number of calls received, percentage of calls answered, and answered is, as I understand it, is we've actually made contact with the taxpayer. Sometimes people call in, we have to call back, can't make contact after several calls. But it gives you all of the percentages, and people write into us. We record the correspondence and how quickly it gets responded to. So we watch all of that very closely. But yeah, that we can certainly provide that information to you.
Yeah, I'm not wanting it. I just wanted to know how you did it. I would have wanted it about 9 months ago, but well, thank you.
All right, seeing no further questions, Mr. Secretary, you could continue.
Okay. Then moving through revenue recovery to financial and document management. This is one of the areas of the department where we are dealing with paper tax returns. And again, we encourage electronic filing, but we still have 8% of taxpayers choosing to file a paper return. And we also have the situation where somebody may file electronically, but they'll drop their check in the mail and to get that float ostensibly. But we have millions of payments coming in, especially like during estimated tax time, which will be next week. We'll have plenty of envelopes coming into the department with checks in them where they could just as easily have paid electronically. So, but that's what financial and document management, that area. And then business support services. We do a lot of quality assurance work there. Kind of deals with all of the information aspects of what gets filed with us and how we capture all that data. So let's move on then to our major tax types. Again, these are the four major methods of financing state government. I've already talked a lot about individual income tax. And as you all know, we have the three bracket system at this point in time, with the top bracket being 5.7% is the highest rate. And individual income tax has been pretty stable. Again, withholding tax being a principal component of that number. And withholding has been very reliable. On page 8, it gives you the individual income tax broken out by adjusted gross income bracket. So if you go down to the sort of the chart or the schedule mid-page, go over to number of returns, you'll see that 428,000 returns were filed by taxpayers who had less than $25,000 of adjusted gross income. And you can see the stratification of the returns and where most of the revenue is coming from that particular source. So again, this particular chart just deals with resident taxpayers, and we have 1.3 million of those. So, okay. Turning over to page 9 gives you some information in terms of filing statuses. This information and these schedules will, I think, be beneficial to you when you start receiving tax bills during the session, when you're looking at adjusting rates and who's impacted and what income group is going to be impacted. And that's why they were provided to you. But on page 9, if you look at that, you'll see the numbers of returns up on top. Again, for resident taxpayers for 2020, the number of returns filing where the taxpayers are filing jointly, and you will see that single taxpayers account for over 600,000 returns of the 1.3 million that were filed by resident taxpayers that year. So, and then the bottom section just deals with the non-resident returns. When we're talking about returns coming in and being processed, we're also paying refunds. Last year, I think we paid, and we'll get to that, I think, $500 million in refunds. I think for the first time ever, we exceeded 900,000 in refunds last year. So, but we do things when these returns come in, and I can't get into a lot of detail, but we have fraud edits that are put in place, and in a given year, we'll get 1.6 million returns that are filed, and we'll probably have 90 to 100,000 that get work listed. That means they get pulled out. They've been identified as possible fraud for who knows what reason, and the return may be perfectly legitimate or it may not. But just to give you an example, we're not going to send a refund check to a bank account out of state when the only return that we've seen is a Kansas tax return and there's been no federal return filed. We're not going to send without checking. We'll put that return on a work list and we'll check to make sure that is a legitimate tax return before that refund is sent to that account. We're not going to send a refund check to an account for a taxpayer where the bank account is different than the prior year. We're going to check with that taxpayer to make sure that is in fact the same taxpayer using a different account. Those are the things, those are simple things, but they're very effective in preventing the wrongful payment of refunds. The last couple of years, we've probably, kept, $4 to $5 million of refunds going out by doing these types of procedures. So sometimes I think well, I don't think, I know, we get calls from taxpayers or legislators on behalf of taxpayers. You know, it's been a delay in their refund. Why haven't they received the refund? And it is likely that for whatever reason, that particular taxpayer may have been flagged, and we are manually looking at that return to make sure that the legitimate refund is going to go to that individual. It's a slower process. It's you know, there's a human being looking at all of that to make sure that it's done correctly.
Do you have connectivity with the IRS to a certain extent to double check those returns, or what does that process entail?
We have an exchange agreement with the IRS, and we exchange information. So, and I can't really go beyond that. So on page 10, you'll see just the number of returns that we file. The top line is total returns. The bottom line is electronic returns. So, you know, again, we're looking at 92%. Improving on that number has been difficult. We've been stuck at 90 to 92% for some time, but it is to the advantage of the taxpayer to file electronically. They're going to get their refund quicker if they do that. So moving on to page 11, that's corporate income tax. Again, I've already talked a lot about this, just the fact that the revenues for the companies, the profits have been unusually high, and that accounts in large part for the increase in revenues. If you look, you know, if you look at even 2018, 392 million up to 806 million, there's been no change in rates. The only thing that's changed is income being reported. So financial institutions over on page 12, again, there was a drop in 2022, again, because there were no PPP loans being processed that year, as had been the case in FY 2021, which accounted for much of that increase in tax revenue. Going over to page 13. And
we have a question from Representative Sawyer, please.
Sure.
Well, we're on privilege tax. You know, we cut the corporate income tax rate 0.5%. Did we also not, did we or did we not cut the privilege tax correspondingly? Because it's really the same thing.
So, the apex rate.
Right.
Okay. And for those of you, the apex legislation, which dealt with the Panasonic plant, that legislation basically said once construction started, a 0.5% corporate rate reduction could occur in the year determined by the Department of Revenue. There's some specific language time frame for doing that. The fact of the matter is the rate reduction at the corporate level will not begin until tax year 2024. But the legislation that you've mentioned did not lower the rate for privileged institutions. Privileged institutions have a lower rate than corporations. And corporation tax is just based upon the income that's earned by the company. It's federal taxable income flows through to the state of Kansas because we conform to the Internal Revenue Code. State of Kansas has some statutory modifications. We get Kansas taxable income, tax rates applied. There's a 4% base rate, which will drop to 3.5% in 2024, and a 3% surtax, which kicks in if the income exceeds $50,000. So you could have up to a 7% tax. For a privileged institution, a bank, the base rate is 2.25%, and for income above $25,000, there's a surtax of 2.125%. So the tax rates are lower, a fair amount lower than the corporate rate. And people, they wonder why is there a distinction? Not sure why the rates are done that way, but banks cannot be subject to income tax because part of their income is derived from federal instruments. And the state can't tax income derived from federal instruments. It's unlawful. So while the corporate income tax is based upon earnings, the privilege tax is just exactly what it is. It is a payment that is made for the privilege of doing business in the state of Kansas, and that tax or fee is basically determined by looking at the next preceding year's income. It's measured by that, but the tax is not on the income. It's just measured by it. And I know it's a fine distinction, but it's a legal distinction that keeps us from having an unconstitutional imposition. So, but a long answer to your question, the Apex bill did not address privileged taxpayers. On
Okay,
page
please.
13, again, some interesting information for you, as you will see bills come before you. For calendar year 2021, these are returns that were processed in 2021. We have roughly 24,000 corporate income tax returns that have come in. Over 60% of those pay no tax. If you look at the percentages and add them up, you'll see that roughly 10% of the corporations pay 98.9% of the tax. So most of the tax is paid by very few, very large corporations. And there are quite a number of smaller corporations that pay no tax at all. And then you can also see the spread for the privilege tax, where roughly, 60% or so of the banks, and we only have 323 privilege tax filers to begin with, roughly 60% of those pay 98% of the privilege tax. So, but, oftentimes we'll get questions when a bill comes through the process, who's this going to impact? You can look at this and kind of get a sense of who's going to be impacted by specific proposals. Moving over to retailer sales and compensating use taxes. Again, we talked a fair amount about that already, and I won't spend any more time on that other than to note that for the compensating use tax, for 2022, it really reflects the marketplace facilitator legislation that was passed in 2021. And that in large part explains that over $100 million increase in revenue from that source. Turning over to page 15.
Mr. Secretary,
again,
we have a question from Representative Epley.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mark. Just on the compensating use tax, or the tax you just spoke of, my memory is that, and I'm looking at the page right now, that our projections were in the $40 to $50 million range on that originally. I mean, I've been here that long, unfortunately, but for 4 years ago. So this is more robust than we had originally. I just want the whole group to understand that it's almost double what we had been projected to obtain through.
Absolutely. It's performed much better than we had anticipated, maybe more than twice as much. I'm thinking the estimate maybe was in the $40 million range, or maybe even less. But yeah, we were surprised at this, and we know these numbers are good. When we have registrations now, we capture whether the entity is going to be as a marketplace facilitator or not. So we track it very closely.
Just one more question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. And as we move forward with this tax, I mean, this is just going to continue to grow, isn't it, over time? Quite a bit.
Well, sort of depends on taxpayer purchasing habits.
Certainly, but my point is, it's grown a lot just in the 2 years we've been able to track it, and
yeah,
it would look like consumer trends are following in line with utilizing this. So
when we look at receipts from sales tax and compensating use tax, we kind of look at them in the aggregate, because, you know, at certain times of the year, one tax may bring in more than another. In the spring, when you're out buying all of these building supplies and hardware to do spring projects, you're probably buying those from a in-store operation. You're going to a brick and mortar building and buying. Sales tax might be up more. In the fall, when you're buying supplies for school and clothing, whatever, you might be, or during the holiday season, you might be online, more so than going into a brick and mortar store. So compensating use tax receipts. So there might be some shifting during the year. So we look at that in the aggregate. But in the aggregate, yes, we've had growth continuously.
thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We also had a question from Representative Wassinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hate to remind you of this, but the governor line item vetoed the sales tax from those marketplace facilitators to lower the food sales tax. Let's see, was that in 20 and then again in 2022? What are the chances of saying right now the excess tax that comes in perhaps goes to lower the sales tax in Kansas, so that we can take the sales tax off of people buying school supplies for the fall or anything else? Any ideas?
Those are all tax policy decisions for the legislature to make in terms of, you know, what to do with tax dollars when they come in. And I sometimes have a difficult time explaining to individuals who deem this to be a new tax. You know, the increase in compensating use tax, that's a new tax. It's not a new tax. It's been on the books since 1937. It just has never been, since 1967 with the National Bellis Hess case. Since that time, we just haven't been able to collect it. So now we can, and these are the results. And again, I think purchasing patterns by Kansas citizens dictate how much is coming in from any particular tax source.
Representative Helgerson.
Well, let me dovetail on that. Professor I had a long time ago, in fact, you may have known him, Glenn Fisher, author of The Three-Legged Stool, as I remember. One of the reasons many of us fought the sales tax going off of food was because he taught that that was the basis of our sales tax. And when we took off the sales tax on food, it weakened that leg of the stool. Now, with the changes in the tax you're referring, which is substituting for at least part of the food sales tax, can you comment at all about trends and policies that we see in still balancing our distribution of various taxes, and how important it is to keep a broad-based plan for collecting taxes? Does that give you enough latitude?
I can't say that we've looked at where we stand right now in terms of whether the three legs of the stool are roughly equal. But, you know, the three-legged stool, you're not putting too much reliance on any one particular tax source. So if you have a particular dip in the economy and your income tax drops down, you still have these other taxes that are going to continue to fund state operations. But, and I think we might make that effort to see where we stand with the lengths of the three legs of the stool, how they stand at this point in time with the developments in the compensating use tax.
Also have a question from Representative Bergkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess with the reduction of the food sales tax rate January 1, I heard some issues that popped up. Have you guys had to work with retailers on that, or have you had to, seen other instances besides, I think Walmart's the one I heard of. I don't know if there's others across the state that had issues with that or not.
Yeah, we've worked very closely with the retail industry for months prior to implementation, and it's a definitional issue. I mean, there are lots of terms involved in terms of defining what is subject to the rate reduction and what isn't. Definitions for prepared food. It's amazing. Our guidance, our written guidance document, I think, is 35 pages long. That goes through all of the definitions, gives all of the examples, but in large part, and again, it is not a simple undertaking to change point of sale systems, but in large part, things worked out very well. On January 1st, first thing in the morning, I went out to 2 different grocery stores and bought food and non-food items, and they were major grocers, and it was done exactly right.
Thank you.
Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. Would it be possible maybe to get a list of business filings from 2019 through 2022 just to see the trend of how things were before COVID and then how we've come out of it for just businesses coming to Kansas or leaving Kansas?
Kathleen, is that something we can? Okay. Could we visit with you offline on this and make sure we're capturing exactly what you want?
Yes, sir.
Sure.
Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here today in your presentation. I wanted to follow up on Representative or Vice Chair Bergkamp's question. We did have an issue. I know it happened in Wichita on the 1st of January of double taxation, sales tax taxation. They were charged the old rate and the new rate for the total sum of the receipt. Do those customers who were not made whole that day, do they have any relief with the Department of Revenue? Should they have to go through that retailer?
The best solution for a customer is to take that receipt right back into the retailer and get the refund at that point in time. And here's why. Sales transactions that take place this month, the tax that's collected on those is not reported until February 25th of next month, and payment made at that point in time. And at that point in time, then the refund has to come from the Department of Revenue, which is not a simple thing, particularly if you're a small consumer. We have a state law that says that the department can't give a refund directly to a consumer if it's less than $50. And so a lot of these,
Yeah, my concern is going to be, and I know it was a short period of time. I think it was just one day and they got it squared away. My concern is the amount of customers that did not notice, they walk out. At the end of the day, either the state of Kansas is going to keep that money that was illegally collected from the consumer, or the retailer is going to keep that money instead of the consumer. So that's my concern. But thank you for that. One other question, I didn't know really where to fit it in, if I may, Mr. Chair. In the KDOT Ike plan a couple years ago, the transportation plan, there was a provision in there about studying road usage charges. Does your department have anything to do with that study? Is that something that we're looking at?
And I'm sorry, I didn't catch
Road
that.
usage charges in place of like the gas tax. Is that something that you guys are involved with Department of Transportation on?
No. Don't think so.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I'm gonna, if we have time, we'll get back to motor fuel tax, but motor fuel tax been relatively stable, but there are other funding sources that are going to have to be developed. And in fact, I saw a bill introduced this session that had a 3-cent fee on kilowatt hours used to recharge vehicles. So, but there are going to have to be user fees, other methods to fund highway repair and construction.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious, how does our definition for food compare to the federal definition for food for assistance programs?
It's very, very similar, Kathleen. Yeah. Yeah, very similar.
Are there any major divergences?
None that come to mind, but we can do a more specific review of that. And if there are any divergences, we can provide that to you.
Yeah, I was just curious when we said we had a 35-page guidance document.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Alcala.
My colleague across the room brings up a good point on the double tax that was charged. Not everybody keeps their receipt after the purchase that day, if it's groceries or whatever. And so that would mean that they've collected extra tax. Who knows what that amount would be? Could the Department of Revenue enforce if they used a credit or debit card that they would be able to track who did not come back to get the funds that were double taxed and put back onto their account, credited to their card? At least it would narrow the margin of people that paid cash versus people that did not keep the receipt, because that means they do draw an extra amount of revenue. I don't know what that would be, but I bet it was a tremendous amount if it was across the state.
The problem is with the credit card and going that route, you still, and I don't know, maybe the company maintains that, I don't know, but you need a statement that breaks out the food and non-food items.
On that, so that credit card would just show a total amount. It wouldn't show the double tax.
Right. Yeah, it would be difficult to go back in, and I'm not sure that citizens, for what's at stake, if they want to undertake that effort.
I understand. I just feel we've let them get away with a lot of extra tax money. We don't even have an idea what that amount could be that did not get recovered back from the consumer.
Yeah, the refund and process in Kansas for sales tax, it's generally you have to go through the retailer, and the retailer files the refund claim on your behalf, and then that money goes back when the refund is paid to the customer, and it gets very complicated when you have thousands of customers who have very small refunds, and going through the effort to try to trace those refunds to make sure they get back to the customer. Soon as we learned about the situation with Walmart, we had advice out there. Please, if you've identified some type of overpayment at all, go right back into the store and talk to the customer service folks and get the money at that point in time. That is the easiest, most efficient way to get reimbursed.
Okay, in the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and continue, please, Mr. Secretary.
All right. Moving over to page 19, just mineral severance tax. Don't want to spend much time on that. Obviously, the dollars are up. Severance tax driven by price and production. So it was up for FY 2022. Some of these other items here, the food sales income tax credit, I don't think I'll spend much time with that, other than just to let you know, we had 70,000 claims. And this is a non-refundable credit that was put in place, 2013 in that time frame. And then on page 21,
Mr. Secretary, we have
Yes.
a question from Representative Francis.
Mr. Secretary, will that food sales income tax credit disappear when the food sales tax goes away? Is it tied to that?
yes, it will end the end of 2014. Under current law. So, and then on page 21, just gives you an idea of the number of homestead property tax refunds that have been paid. Again, 70,000 for 2022. And you'll remember this year there's another component of this another avenue of relief that will be effective for 2022 and will allow folks over 65, disabled veterans. You have to have household income under 50,000. You have to have a house that's valued less than 350,000. You can get you establish a base year for your property, and if the property tax goes up the next year, you get the difference between those years refunded to you. Our homestead forms, and there are three options, and you can't do all three. You can pick one, but our page is up and live. That I think occurred on January 10th. So folks are in the process of filing to get these refunds right now. So on page 22, I won't go over that again. I kind of mentioned that earlier. And then we can jump to the last page because there are a couple of items here that I think you will be interested in. Just to, again, summarize for fiscal year or calendar year 2022, 1,006,000 tax returns were processed, 929,000 refunds were issued. That was over $500 million. 542 million was refunded. The refund times were the quickest refund times that we've had at the department, as low as 3 to 5 days from the date of filing. That 929,000 refunds also is a record number of refunds in a given tax year.
We have a question from Representative Corbett.
Thank you. One thing you didn't mention, or I missed it. How many people do you have in the state that collect sales tax? Small business people from Walmart, who basically, last I heard a couple of years ago, it's like 30,000 kind of state employees, collecting money for you. Do you have a number? Is that growing?
So the number of registered retailers collecting sales tax, that's what do we have a sense of that?
I don't, but we can get it.
Don't have it with us today, but that is something we can definitely identify.
Thank you.
When I have these questions, and we will be gathering information that we don't have today, I assume it's acceptable to the chairman to either provide that to you to share with the committee, or we can provide it to all of the committee members. I'm looking for guidance.
The best way is not to send it to me because it'll get lost. Send it to the committee assistant, Leah, and she will quite efficiently get it out to the committee. So thank you.
Very good. Other items that, or other projects that took place in calendar year 2022, we, again, using more technology in our audit function. We're also, and you will get to see this in person on January 23rd when you tour our channel management section at the department. Channel management, again, is the front end of the process when everything comes in, and it's how we get paper documents into the system and that information on those documents disseminated to all of our operating systems, how those checks get deposited. It's an interesting process, but we were in a situation where the equipment and the software, the technology was getting near its end of life. And so, again, with existing resources, we undertook to update that process, and you will get to see it in action. And it's, again, one of the most critical areas of the department in terms of getting revenues where they need to be. So now, I make reference then to the reduction of the state sales tax and that being implemented, but I've got the information guides identified. If you get questions from constituents, you can direct them to those publications. We have questions and answers. We also have a staff at the department, and again, we'll provide you contact information that you can just send those individuals to the department and we'll answer their questions. One of the other things that the department did in 2022 was implement the Salt Parity Act that was enacted last session. And as you will recall, that legislation was brought about to allow certain taxpayers, to avoid the $10,000 limitation on state and local taxes at the federal level. This legislation means nothing to the state of Kansas, other than the fact that we have to administer this. And what has happened is that the scenario is you have an S corporation or a limited liability company where all the income flows through the owners, the shareholders, or members, and they report that income on their individual income tax returns and pay taxes. But they are subject at the federal level to the $10,000 state and local tax deduction limitation. So to get around that at the federal level, they now, for Kansas purposes, have the opportunity to make an election on their entity return, whether it's an S corporation or an LLC, to have that entity pay the tax on that, all of that income would be distributed to all of the owners. Instead of the owners paying it, it's paid by the entity, which is not subject to the $10,000 cap. That's how you get around the cap. And then once that's paid by the entity, all of the owners, shareholders get a credit for the tax that was paid by the entity, their proportionate share of the credit of that tax that was paid. All of this, again, means nothing to the state of Kansas. It's a wash. But what has happened because of this is, last month's receipts were high for corporate income tax. And what has happened is that in order to take advantage of this deduction, these entities filed estimated tax payments in December to be able, for federal purposes, to take the deduction in December. And they've never been able to do this before. So in December, we had, I think, over $100 million come in. I'm trying to think, I'll take that back. In December, we had, of these flow-through entities, we had 1,795 of them pay estimated tax payments of $129 million, okay? Those same companies, another 1,898 wrote checks on December 30th or 31st, and we received them in January, over 100 million more. So what that means is we're shifting from an income tax where the shareholders and owners would have paid estimated tax payments on all of this income in January. We're not going to see a lot of that because it's been shifted to corporate income tax because of this SALT parity election, and these dollars have been shifted to corporate income tax now instead of individual income tax. Again, it's just kind of moving money between months, and we, quite frankly, didn't anticipate that much activity. This is and I apologize, this is a complicated mechanism that has been put in place, but the number of returns and the amounts that have been involved are much larger than we had anticipated. But again, it's just movement of money. The money, from the state of Kansas, it doesn't, it's not going to cost us anything. It's just interesting how many owners of LLCs and S corps are utilizing this and making this selection. So,
Representative Francis, question.
This may not be a question that you can answer, but if your LLC or your subchapter S pays the taxes, how do they know what the income tax rate, the graduated income tax rate is for each of the individual members? I mean, they could vary based upon their status.
Here's how the legislature addressed that. Instead of looking at the individual income tax rates for each of the shareholders, the tax that was imposed was a maximum 5.7 marginal tax rate for income tax. So the shareholders, if they would have received that income, they would have maybe paid a lesser rate, but they've elected to have the corporation pay it at a 5.7%, so they can get the advantage of getting around the $10,000 cap, but they get a credit. Their share of that credit goes to each of them, and they can claim it on their individual income tax return. So that's why it means nothing to Kansas.
That also applies to the federal rate, the federal income tax rate. You said they just pay the top rate, and they do that federally also?
No, feds would the federal provisions would apply. This just only applies to the Kansas imposition, the 5.7%, which again is all deductible for federal purposes.
Okay, Representative Helgerson.
For the life of me, I can't remember that legislation. And does anybody, what was the bill number?
Well, look to research for that. I can't remember.
That was one of the items in Senate substitute for House Bill 2239.
I'm sorry, it was what?
Senate substitute for House Bill 2239.
Did we have hearings on it here?
I know the Senate committee had a hearing on it. I cannot specifically recall if this committee did.
Yes.
I know you said it had no significance to the state, but my accountants contacted me, and I'm sure hundreds of other. This was a big deal for a lot of people, and this was a big change in tax policy, and we didn't even have a hearing on it on our side. I may be alone, but could staff give me some breakdown and history of how it was proposed and how and why it was done, and that's sometime in the future?
Yeah, that's definitely something our office can provide.
And Mr. Chairman, we sometimes get a lot of things thrown at us in the Senate, by the Senate. Anytime there's a major tax policy, it's a concern that we don't even have that discussion here in the House, and that a few individuals make this major shift in tax, or it may not be a major shift tax policy, but it was a major shift tax policy for over 100 million. You said $120 million?
Well, again, from the perspective of the state general fund, it doesn't mean anything. It's a wash. And again, it's complicated.
I understand that.
Yeah.
And maybe it doesn't mean anything to the bottom line of the state of Kansas, but there was a shifting of major tax dollars. And I'd at least like to know more about the tax policies that went into effect since we passed the laws that went into effect.
Please continue. Yep.
I'll try to finish here. One of the another programs that was passed last session.
Representative Bryce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't mean to interrupt. Mr. Secretary, as you said, I know that much is done to flag potentially fraudulent tax returns and prevent fraudulent refunds. Do you have any way of tracking how much potential fraudulent refunds are sent out annually?
I don't think so. I'll check. What we know is what we've stopped. That's, how we would know otherwise. I'm not sure unless we did individual, and we don't do individual income tax audits in Kansas.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, do you know how much you stop annually?
Yeah. Roughly 5 million, maybe more. I think this year we had maybe 1,300 to 1,400 taxpayers that we flagged as fraudulent. Last year it was a lesser amount, but lesser number of taxpayers, but about the same amount. But what we have done also in this process is in 2021, we disqualified 14 tax preparers. And I think that number dropped to 7 in 2022, that we would not accept returns that they prepared because of continuing issues.
Okay, please continue.
The final program that was a monumental effort to get in place was the COVID-19 Storefront Retail Property Tax Relief Act. And this was passed this last session. And essentially there was $50 million of ARPA money was set aside to provide financial assistance to anyone who was impacted, any business impacted by either shutdowns or restricted operations. You could only have so many individuals in your shop, that sort of thing. And it was a methodology for coming up with how you determine the actual amount that was would be available. It applied to tax year 2020 and 2021. There were lots of qualifying criteria that you had to meet. You couldn't have been delinquent in property taxes prior to 2020, and you had to have so much income in 2019, and if your income dropped in 20 and 21, then you might be eligible. But the legislation also was very limiting in terms of the types of businesses that would qualify. And I think in general, it was businesses where you had face-to-face meetings with customers, restaurants, whatever. But you were limited to, the benefit was $5,000 for each year. That was the max you could get. And what we're discovering is that the program is not being utilized heavily at this point in time. We have an online application that went live on October 3rd. Very few applications have come in and fewer have been approved. And some of it is just the way the statute was put together. For example, in 2021, when you're looking at shutdown days and restricted days, there was no database to determine that, so we had to develop that by working with the counties. But for that second year, 2021, there were no shutdown days. And there were only 7 counties with restricted days. So that pretty much limits the benefit that's going to be given to applicants for 2021. So I think that once applicants got in and looked at the criteria, they just realized they don't qualify, or it's not worth the effort to do the legwork to get it done. So anyway, but applicants have until April 15th to file an application. My office has prepared some information that will be forwarded to all legislators, that if you have constituents that you think might benefit from this, you can just forward that email on to them with the information, and they can go online. One of the other difficulties with the program, it has nothing to do with this legislation, but these are ARPA funds. And because it's federal money, you have to get registered with ks.gov with the federal government. And that is something that doesn't happen overnight. So in order to make your application, you have to have that sam.gov registration number before you can even apply. And these are federal requirements that we'd have to adhere to. So it's that information is, again, will be provided to you. You can forward it on to your constituents for their review and possible use. Okay. As far as this coming year, we're looking to have the same sort of refund cycle, the timing of that. And perhaps one of the most important things we're trying to do right now is to develop our next level of management to move up. Yesterday, I did a pin ceremony for service awards. We had 145 employees with 2,240 years of experience. Many of those are going to be leaving the department in the next few years. So we have to have that next level developed, because these are not things that you learn overnight that we deal with. So that's all I have to say today.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you for the extensive report. We'll dive into that in detail on our own. Thank you for taking all of the questions. Committee, are there any final questions? Seeing none, thank you once again for your time. Committee, that concludes our business for the day. So if there's nothing else for the good of the committee, we are adjourned.